Hello again and welcome back to our course on PSE 15. In this section we're going to continue looking at selection, but very specifically in this section I'm going to look at refining selections. So far we've looked at most of the available tools for making selections, and depending on the quality of selection that you need, some of the tools and some of the techniques I've shown you may enable you to make the selections you need in many situations. And as I pointed out earlier, sometimes you can use feathering to just soften the edges of a selection enough to, shall we say, get away with it. But sometimes you actually need to make a good, accurate selection. And the sorts of situations where it's difficult to do that are things like with hair and animal fur, and in this case the wool on this sheep. Now, we've already used this sheet to make a few selections, and at a distance most of them have looked okay. But supposing I'm dealing with an edge like this, where I really do need to make an accurate selection. This particular example is not that unusual. It's not a particularly sharp edge anyway that I'm trying to select against. Maybe the sheep moved, maybe it was slightly out of focus, all sorts of reasons why it may be a little bit blurry. But you can see the edge of the wool. And if I wanted to follow the edge of that as accurately as possible, let's look at two or three of the options for making an accurate selection, including this part of its head. One option that you should already be aware of is that I could use one of the selection tools, such as the quick selection tool, to make a selection, and then I could use the selection brush, as I showed you in the preceding section, and quite meticulously add and subtract from the selection, and with that approach I could achieve whatever accuracy my time and patience would allow me to achieve. So that's certainly an option, albeit usually quite a time-consuming one. What I've done now is to select the sheep's head, and I've zoomed in right to the top of the head. You can see the edge of the selection, and actually it's not a bad selection really. This has been done with the quick selection tool and a little bit of patience. However, as an example of a selection that's not quite perfect, let's look at the next approach for improving the selection edge, and that's to use the Refine Edge dialog. When you use this dialog, it appears against a transparent background by default, and there are a whole range of controls, different options you can try. I'm going to work through two or three of them now, but really this is something you have to experiment with. You have to take one or two images, perhaps ones that you've found difficult to make good selections on, and try each of these, supported by the PDFs and by the online help. Let's take a look at a couple of the options in the middle though, because one of the advantages of this dialog is that you can preview what effect some of these changes has on a selection edge. Let's look again at feathering, which is pretty much right in the middle. It's currently set at 0. Note the tooltip there, soften selection edge. What I'm going to do is to move it to about midway. I want you to look at the edge carefully now, and you can see there that's quite an extreme effect because I've used a lot of feathering, but you can see the sort of effect that feathering has. It's not so much that it makes the selection any better, it just disguises it very well. By giving you a little bit of what's deselected around the outside, you don't see how imperfect the selection is. Another one of the very good options to try here is smoothing. And what smoothing does is to take out any jagged edges. So let's try some smoothing. I'll just put a little bit on to begin with. Look again at the edge. As I increase the smoothing, you'll see that generally speaking everything along that edge is getting smoothed out. Now that may look quite artificial this close up to the wool, but if you try that and then zoom right out from the sheep again, you'll see that one of the advantages is that there are no jagged edges which are going to stick out when people are looking at this image and be particularly noticeable. So that's smoothing. You can also try adding some contrast. Let's add a bit of contrast, the contrast between the selected area, the edge and the rest. So let's increase the contrast. You notice how that makes the edge appear darker and a sharper contrast. And then the other option to try is radius. Smaller values of radius are particularly good for sharp edges. Where you have softer edges, try a larger value of the radius, such as this one where it is a softer edge. And again, what you'll see there is that it doesn't quite disguise it, but it's more, if you like, sympathetic to the existing edge. And it does this by allowing a little bit more variation around the detected edge. In this case, I think that higher value for radius corresponding to the softer edge has quite a good effect. And again, if you zoom out and take a look at the whole sheep subject to this edge refinement, I think you'll find that an increased radius works very well in this case. But as I say, you need to try these settings on specific examples and get used to what impact each of them has. The third option that we're going to look at is the Refine Selection brush, which, once you understand how to use it, is pretty straightforward to use, although it can be quite time consuming. And as usual, it really comes down to whether you've got the time or the need in a particular situation to make a selection more accurate. With this particular sheep, for example, as I've already pointed out, from a distance, the selection that I made using the straightforward tools was probably perfectly adequate. But if you do need to make something really accurate, the Refine Selection brush is another way of achieving a very high level of accuracy. Having said that, it's generally not quite as time consuming as the selection brush is. Now, in order to demonstrate it, what I'm going to do is to use that existing selection, and I'm going to concentrate on that ear where the selection is not particularly good. PSE has been somewhat confused by the inner part of the ear and has missed most of the wool on the outer part of the ear, particularly the part towards the bottom of the ear. So let's select the Refine Selection brush. It's this one. In this case, we get this red background by default. If you click on the drop down, you can choose an alternative color if you want. And what we do is to use a tool which has an inner circle and an outer circle. Now, the current size is set at 400 pixels, which is going to be too big even to explain it. So let me put it down to 40 pixels. There's the tool. The tool, as I say, has an outer circle and an inner circle, and the inner circle will either contain a minus or a plus. When it contains a plus, you'll be adding to the selection. When it contains a minus, you will be subtracting, taking away from the selection. Now, the basic principle behind this is that I'm going to run this tool along the edge of the selection, and if I've got the minus sign showing, that is, if the center of the tool is outside the selection, I'm going to be taking selection away. If I've got the plus sign showing, it's on the inside of the selection, just move it across here, I'll be adding to the selection. I'm going to make the size of the Refine Selection brush a little bit smaller. In fact, I'll set it at 20 pixels, I think. And the general idea here is I'm going to remove the Refine Selection brush over that edge where the wool is missing. And by moving it over that edge, I'm going to restore the missing part. So, go to the start, click, start to move along. Now watch what happens. You can just see through the outer part there how the missing wool is now being made part of the selection. I'm also getting some more of the background, but if I release that, when it's finished thinking about it, you'll see that that should be a significantly better selection. Now, this is quite labor intensive, and as you can see, you're going to need to be quite accurate to get good results. But overall, in many situations, it can tend to be a lot quicker than using the selection brush. There are quite a few more details of how to effectively use this tool, particularly if you look in the Elements PDF. There's a long explanation of the concentric circles, the options that are available, and the options to both add to selections, subtract from selections, and to push in on selections and so on. Once again, the need for this tool, how much time you're prepared to spend on it, I'm sure will depend on how accurate you need your selections to be. But once you get the hang of this tool, it can be a very good one to use. That's the end of this section. I'll see you in the next one.